Belgian Art Nouveau illustrator, designer and artist Henri Privat Livemont was born in Brussels in 1861. His work is frequently unfavourably compared to that of Alphonse Mucha, and some critics dismiss him as a mere copyist. But as the two actually began working on poster designs simultaneously, this seemed somewhat unlikely. He studied art at the Saint-Just Academy in Brussels, and between 1883 to 1889 he worked in a Parisian interior design company, but no evidence from this time exists. The first dated examples of his poster designs I found were from 1896, although I suspect there would have been earlier work which hasn't survived. And although all his work can be firmly categorised as Art Nouveau, he revealed a range of subjects and approach to composition quite distinct from the more formally structured images of his contemporaries. Such was the reputation he acquired only a year later in 1897, he was commissioned to design the poster announcing the Brussels International Exposition. Despite the large volume of posters he was creating at this time, he also had an academic role as professor of drawing, and he continued to work on more architectural design projects with great success. He was particularly adept with the incorporation of ceramic tiles, but also designed stained glass and a host of design features for the facades of private and public buildings. Among his greatest enduring achievements in this context was the decoration of Brussels' Grande Maison de Blanc in 1897. In 1900 he returned to Brussels and carried on with his architectural projects, and for the next few years at least also continued to produce aesthetically pleasing posters. In 1903 he published a series of popular floral prints, but by this stage, as engaging as his posters were, his earlier compositional diversity seems to have been replaced by a more formulaic approach, which favoured generally close-quarter profiles of attractive females. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, Art Nouveau was clearly losing its grip as a dominant style, as modernism in graphics, architecture and design rapidly took over across Europe. And just like his contemporary Mucha, at that point Privat Livemont abandoned virtually all other work in favour of a career as an artist. And that's how he spent the rest of his life up to his death in 1936 at the age of 75. Raymond de la Nezière is yet another illustrator for whom I can find a reasonable amount of decent resolution images, but almost nothing in terms of biography. He was born in Strasbourg in the east of France in 1865, but he and his family moved to the centrally located Bourges in 1870. He later went on to study at the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris and is recorded as having started work as a book illustrator in 1892 when he would have been 27 years old. But the earliest verified examples I found were these comic pages from an unknown publication, surprisingly printed in colour 2 years later in 1894. In 1897 he illustrated the book Au Galop à travers les âges, a series of humorous pen drawings about the history of the relationship between humans and horses. And his own apparent interest in horses and riding manifested itself in quite a lot of the work he created in the later years of the 19th century. But it was his work for children which occupied most of his time and energy, and he was particularly popular in Le Jeudi de la Jeunesse, for which he illustrated the hilarious story of the pig family. This sequential comic strip revealed his conspicuous talent for drawing amusing anthropomorphic animals, and the series was popular enough to merit publication as a book in 1902. He was also creating a large volume of illustration for several Parisian human magazines, including Le Sourire, Le Rire and La Vie Parisienne at this time. Some of it continued to feature horsey subject matter, but there were also more broadly comedic examples. In 1908, the tale of un Sherlock Holmes à quatre pattes was published as a picture book. Like the pig family, this had been originally created as a successful and enduring comic strip, and was yet more evidence of his anthropomorphic and comic narrative abilities. His book and magazine work continued into the next decade, but in 1914 war with Germany was declared, and de la Nezière became less prolific. and although not all his work made reference to the war, more patriotic but frequently absurdist illustrations dominated his output. When the war ended, he became more prolific again, and in 1919 he illustrated The Tale of the Lion from Le Buffon Amusant by Georges-Louis Leclerc. And alongside his ongoing production of comic and magazine work, he created a memorably entertaining edition of Les Fables de La Fontaine, with a series of particularly humorous and graphically appealing images of great accomplishment. More bookwork, a lot of which was also humorous and animal-themed, followed throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. He also produced some agreeably rendered but less convincing actual wildlife illustration, and most unusually he published an oddly serious alphabet book of the saints in 1932. Raymond de la Nezière appears to have stopped working around the outbreak of the Second World War, but he was already in his 70s and it's quite likely he simply retired. And he died in 1953 when he was 88 years old. Thomas Maitland Cleland was born in 1880 in Brooklyn, New York, and other than a brief spell at the Artisan Institute in New York, he was self-taught. He left school at the age of 16 and began working as a book designer for the Cleland Press. The company folded 4 years later in 1900, and he subsequently moved to Boston where he established the Cornhill Press, and it seems he worked pretty much exclusively as a typographic and book designer during the earlier years of the century. The earliest example I found of anything you could reasonably call illustration was this pair of textbook images from 1916. And it wasn't until 1924 that the first evidence of more creative illustrative work appeared, when he produced publicity material for General Motors. And in the same year he created a series of significantly attractive pochoir printed calendar images for an unknown client. But his output of illustration increased dramatically, and in the following year he was commissioned to create several immaculate, nostalgically styled and themed colour covers for Westvaco Paper Corporation's in-house magazine. And he also created a striking poster for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the same year. In 1928 he created a large body of publicity and advertising work for Cadillac cars. And as well as some deco-style brochures, most significantly he was commissioned to create remarkably attractive scenic watercolour rendered press ads. These illustrations portrayed the joys of motoring through a series of idyllic rural and urban environments to entice the potential customer, and they were very successful in their mission. A year later he was hired as the art director at Fortune magazine, and although he kept this job for over a decade, he seems to have been content to confine himself to the creation of only a couple of cover illustrations. But even while working for Fortune, he produced occasional covers for other magazines and continued to accept other commissions, including work for Rolls-Royce cars and a series of period-style illustrations for a company making offset lithographic printing presses to demonstrate the quality of their work. In the 1940s, Cleland became increasingly involved in the creation of limited editions of classic literature for the Heritage Press. One of the most successful of these was The Life and Death of the Late Jonathan Wild, written by Henri Fielding in the 18th century, which was published as an edition of 1,500 copies in 1943. Each book contained 30 colour illustrations, all of which were printed using the laborious pochoir stencil process. Many of these images required up to a dozen different stencils, which necessitated around 45,000 individual images and a team of colourists to complete the project. Following this major triumph, examples of Cleland's illustration work thin out considerably, and this 1949 oil painting, which he created as a gift for the actor Joseph Cotton, is all I found until 1952, when he returned to the work of Henri Fielding and the Heritage Press for the history of Tom Jones. This time he avoided the logistical nightmare of the pochoir process and stuck with pen and watercolour for an impressive collection of period narrative images. And the last dated work I found was a similar series for the book Monsieur Beaucaire, written by Booth Tarkington and published in 1961. And Thomas Maitland Cleland died 3 years later in 1964 in Danbury, Connecticut, at the age of 84. Joan Hassall was born in 1906 in London, the daughter of the hugely successful comedic illustrator John Hassall. But unlike her father, she took an altogether more serious-minded and craft-based approach to her work, and became known for the quality of her wood engraving. She initially trained and worked as a teacher and quickly came to the conclusion that she wasn't cut out for the job. Subsequently, she worked as her father's secretary for a couple of years before enrolling into the Royal Academy School in 1928. Most significantly, in 1931, she began taking evening classes in wood engraving, and she instantly became convinced that this was how she wished to make images for the rest of her life. Early on, most of her work was created as art in the form of limited edition prints, but in 1936 she was commissioned to illustrate the title page for her brother Christopher's book of poems Devil's Dyke. And her first significant commission came the following year in 1937, with illustrations for Francis Brett Young's Portrait of a Village. Hassall travelled extensively around the rural area that was the focus of the book, making sketches which she then produced as aesthetically pleasing and skillfully executed woodcuts. Although the great majority of her work was wood engraved, she also used scraper board and occasionally pen and ink, and she had moderate success with her oil paintings too. In 1940, Hassall produced another set of wood engravings to illustrate the novel Cranford, written by Elizabeth Gaskell in 1843. And with her trademark thoroughness, she carried out a great deal of research into the costumes of the period and persuaded friends to pose dressed in appropriate Georgian costume. Other than Cranford, there's little evidence of her published work during the war years, and it's recorded that she taught book illustration and drawing at Edinburgh College of Art at this time. But the period after the war was one of great productivity, and among her published work was 1947's A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson, featuring a series of charming spot illustrations to accompany each verse. In 1950, she created many attractive wildlife illustrations for The Strange World of Nature by Bernard Gooch. And in 1953 she designed the invitation to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, an extremely rare excursion into colour work. Although Hassall continued to enjoy success with her limited edition prints, between 1957 and 1962 she was predominantly occupied with a particularly extensive series of illustrations for a 7-volume edition of the novels of Jane Austen published by the Folio Society, and they were still being reprinted decades later. Her last major work was an edition of the poems of Robert Burns for the Limited Editions Club in 1965, and this was a suitably diverting collection of images with which to end her illustration career. Unfortunately, in later life her eyesight started to fail, and in 1976 Hassall retired to the village of Malham in Yorkshire, and that's where she died in 1988 at the age of 82. So as usual, I hope you found something of interest among these offerings, and all being well, another 4 will be arriving fairly soon.